Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Kreisky Forum. My name is Viola Raheb. I'm an Austrian with Palestinian roots, originating from Bethlehem, and I'm really very honored to be moderating this evening with our special guest, Matthew Teller, a writer who has worked as a journalist for many agencies, the BBC, the Times, the Guardian, the Independent, the Financial Times, and other global media. He's produced and presented many documentaries for the BBC and has written several travel guides. Tonight we'll be talking about his book on Jerusalem, The 9 Quarters of Jerusalem, a new biography of the old city. Matthew, welcome to Vienna, welcome to Kreisky Forum, and thank you so much for being here and for your willingness to present the book. We also welcome not only those present with us tonight here at Kreisky Forum, but also those who are with us online. I would like to start by asking the audience to please maybe raise your hands. Who of you have been to Jerusalem? Okay, so almost 100%.
Almost, that's quite a few.
Almost 100%. So, great, because I'd like to invite you to join Matthew tonight on an extraordinary visit to Jerusalem.
Remotely, virtually.
Virtual, yeah. Virtual extraordinary visit to Jerusalem. And I would like to start with, before giving Matthew the possibility to go with us through the book, with a small quote from the book, as maybe a hint to what is coming tonight. Eyes truthfully aren't much help in Jerusalem. Whatever you're looking at, this street, that building, these people, those weapons, you can't know the truth of it from what you see. What you see no more embodies truth than our face embodies our inner reality. With that, I would like to ask Matthew to go with us on this virtual visit to Jerusalem, and then we will get into some of the content of the book in a discussion first between Matthew and me, and then with you all here at the Kreisky Forum. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank
Welcome.
you so much. Thank you. That's very, very kind of you indeed. The honor is all mine. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I should say I'm sorry for speaking in English and not in German. I could speak in German, but it wouldn't take very long. My German is very elementary, so thank you very much for bearing with me in English. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be speaking here at the Bruno Kreisky Forum in the city of Vienna. Thank you to Gertrud Auer, the Secretary General of the Forum, and thank you to Viola. Thank you to honored guests and to everybody for coming out tonight. What I'll do is I'll just introduce the book for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, with some pictures. And then we'll move to a discussion, and then we'll move to questions. So, the first thing that I would like to say is that Jerusalem is not my city, and it never will be my city. While I was researching and writing this book, I was very aware of centuries, 150 years, maybe even more, maybe 200 years, of people like me, white, English-speaking, middle-aged, middle-class men, above all men, claiming Jerusalem for themselves, or for their nation, or for their empire, for their religion, and then proceeding to tell everybody else, often at length and often in print, why their claim to the city matters so very, very much indeed. That's not why I've done what I've done, as I hope you'll see if you get a chance to read the book. I wrote this book because I could see an imbalance in narratives about Jerusalem, in my culture, English-speaking culture. Because of my work, I'm lucky to have a platform from which to speak. And I wanted to use that platform to help redress the balance. But it's a tricky word, balance. We hear it most often in relation to the news media. And it conjures these images of a seesaw. It implies there are two sides. In this case, an Israeli side, which is very often conflated with Jewish, and a Palestinian side. And the wisdom runs, if you devote equal resources to both sides, the seesaw will end up level. You will have achieved balance. But as I set out to show in this book, Jerusalem has many more sides than two. It would be misleading to reduce Jerusalem to two sides. The idea of two sides and ideas about those two sides being irreconcilable are a fiction. And any balance that may result from treating two sides equally will never be an equitable balance, because Israel has the overwhelmingly larger proportion of power, assets, resources, influence, status, visibility. The seesaw is not level to begin with. So to achieve an equitable balance, you have to act unequally. So in this book, I haven't taken equal numbers of stories about Jewish people and Jewish Jerusalem and everybody else. The book favors those who begin with fewer advantages. I'm choosing to amplify the voices of the unlistened to. I'm very lucky indeed to have been visiting Jerusalem since I was a child, 40-something years ago. My first visit was in 1980, and then in 1982, my father, amazingly, arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice. Once at the synagogue that we used at home in London, and then again at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I've been coming back to the city all my life, traveling, living, working, visiting. I've put up an image here of the old city of Jerusalem, which many people have been, but if perhaps you don't know, this is the walled area at the center of the wider city, which is where not all, but most of the most significant holy places are located, still behind their 450-year-old Ottoman walls. And I should add that this is not a big place. The area inside the walls is less than 1 square kilometre. About 35,000 people live there, 90% of whom are Palestinian. One motivation for me writing this book was, on all those visits over my teens and my 20s and my 30s and my 40s, was seeing how people like me, tourists or visitors or pilgrims, outsiders, would encounter and marginalize the people who live and work in this area. I could see that people were visiting, in a sense, and this is not unique to Jerusalem, I think this is common to touristed cities anywhere, but they were visiting with a tick box. I've come to pray at the church. I've come to visit the mosque. I've come to kiss the Western Wall, whatever it is. And that leads to a situation where between me and my holy place, all these people in between are an impediment. They're getting in the way. All the commerce and the business, or people who are taking their kids to school or bringing their kids back from school, or who are looking for somebody to fix their bathroom, or they're buying a piece of furniture, whatever, they're just living their lives. Because they're living next to the holy places, they're seen as somehow getting in the way. I could see this happening a lot with people who were visiting. The people ended up less important than the holy places were, which I thought was wrong, and I thought for a long time about how to write about it, how to deconstruct that philosophy. Another motivation for me writing this book was seeing how the reality of the old city didn't match up to the maps that all the people like me, the visitors and the outsiders, were using. So I've downloaded from the internet. This is from news media, but they're very similar to the kind of maps that you might see in a tourist brochure or online or in an atlas. When they show the old city, they invariably show the old city divided into 4: Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. And very often, with these very sharp, clear lines of division between each. But as you'll know, if you spend time in Jerusalem, there are no sharp, clear lines of division. Like between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter, there is no line there. That line is just a street. It's a market street. It's a very beautiful market street. It's very atmospheric. It's not very wide. 3 meters, maybe 4 meters wide, maybe. It's lined with commerce. There are shops on both sides. There are people on both sides. There aren't really both sides. It's just a street. The sense of exclusivity that these maps promote is quite wrong. There are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter. There are people living everywhere. But I could see that people approaching Jerusalem for the first time might imagine that these quarters are somehow holy. This is a holy city. Has it been divided into holy quarters? It's a mistake. But from that mistake, it's then a short step to the next mistake, which is thinking that perhaps Christians aren't even allowed into the Muslim quarter, say, or the Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter. You have a situation then where a Christian visitor thinks that the Muslim quarter is somehow, enemy territory. This is not my place. It's off limits to me. I should stay away, which is quite wrong. These sorts of maps, it strikes me, are a very Western conception. They look, to me, like a sort of atlas of Europe, where the nation states all lock together. Or possibly also a map of the United States of America, which is perhaps even more instructive, because if you think of a map of America, the state borders erase the lands of the Native American people who were there before the settlers arrived. And in a similar way, in the Jerusalem context, these maps also erase an indigenous reality of the city. So where did this idea come from? I started to do some research. Now, there's a much longer story to tell here about the history of cartography in Jerusalem going back centuries and millennia, which we won't have time for tonight, but we can start in a particular place. We can start here, which is the first map of Jerusalem, which has been drawn from measurements actually taken in the field, on the ground. This dates from 1818. There's a lot to say about this map. We're focusing on a particular story, so what I've done is just highlighted the only label on the map that refers to ethno-religious settlement within the city of Jerusalem, and that's a label which maybe you can't see from the back there, is Judenstadt. The next major advance in cartography of Jerusalem is this one, which is 1835, and again, the only label which refers to ethno-religious settlement is Jews' quarter, but now we start to see labels which I've highlighted here for the Armenian convent, for the Greek convent, for the Latin convent. These are areas of Christian settlement around these churches which reflect the concerns of Europeans who are encountering Jerusalem and exploring Jerusalem in more detail for the first time in this period. And then in 1837 came a map, coincidentally perhaps, published here in the city of Vienna by a man called Hermann Engel. And again, we have a Jewish quarter, but now we have a Turkish quarter, and a Greek quarter, and an Armenian quarter, and a Latin quarter. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time that these names appear on a map. And this period, the 1830s, was a period of political upheaval in Jerusalem and in all of Palestine as well. There had been a rebellion led from Egypt, which had challenged Ottoman rule. There had been a popular uprising in Palestine itself, which had led to a power vacuum. You had the European powers jockeying for position, trying to restore order, but also trying to take advantage of the instability to advance their own interests as well. And then, in 1840, Britain did what it often did in these situations. It bombed Palestine into submission and handed Palestine back to the Ottomans, but British forces remained. And in 1841, 2 military officers arrived in Jerusalem to survey the city. But that conflict of 1840 wasn't just about geopolitics. British evangelical Protestant missionaries had long had their eye on the unevangelized people of the Ottoman Empire. They were unable to convert Muslims because Ottoman law at that time stipulated death for people who converted away from Islam. They were unable to convert Catholics or Orthodox Christians because partly there was little willingness in those communities to convert anyway, but then also France was protecting Catholic rights, and Imperial Russia was protecting Orthodox rights. So if you start to mess with the communal balance, you start to cause a diplomatic row, which at that time Britain wanted to avoid. And there had long been, and in fact there still is today, a strain in Protestant evangelical thinking that sees the conversion of the Jews as a prelude to the second coming of Christ. So at this time, we see that British efforts go into converting the Jews, which meant that they needed to know exactly who lived where. Britain appointed the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem, a man called Michael Alexander, who was formerly a rabbi, who converted to Christianity. He arrived in 1842, and with him was a young chaplain whose name was George Williams. He was only 27, and he only stayed in Jerusalem just over a year. But in 1849, he published a new edition of his book, The Holy City, and it included a map, which had been drawn from the British military survey of a few years previously, but Williams added all the labelling to it, including Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. As far as I can tell, George Williams, aged 27, was the instigator of the idea of dividing Jerusalem into 4 quarters. Maps before him did not show them. And just about every single map ever produced since has shown them. There's a direct line from George Williams in 1849 to the maps of Jerusalem that we all see and use today, reinforced in the media and in academia and in guidebooks and in literature, in tourist maps, on the internet, every conceivable medium. Why has the idea of the 4 quarters survived? It survived because it suits and has suited the colonial ambitions of successive waves of the rulers of Jerusalem, right down to our own time. The quarters are false. They were invented by a 19th century British missionary. They always were false. But it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against themselves, to foster this sectarian division. Even Williams himself, this is an extract from his book, he was aware that he was deliberately marginalizing the lived experience of Jerusalem's own people. One historian talked of 39 quarters of Jerusalem in the 13th century. Another one described 18 quarters of Jerusalem in 1495. And even today, if you think of all the communities, all the different ethnicities and religions and social identifications of the people who live and work inside the old city, for Williams and for all of the map makers of Jerusalem since, all those people are, as it says here, numerous but unimportant. I beg to differ. Those subdivisions, which reflect the mixed nature of the city's populations, are very, very important. As a journalist, I'm specifically interested in how we think of Jerusalem when we only ever see it depicted as being divided into sectarian, ethno-religious quarters. So I just want to take a little bit of time, just to return to the map, just to look at some of Jerusalem's many, many marginalized communities of today. I was very lucky indeed to spend some time talking to and also writing about these people, the people at the Indian hospice in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has many of these hospices, which is a word in this context that refers specifically to a Muslim religious institution, specifically one related to mystical Islam, to Sufism. This is a really fascinating place. This commemorates a legendary visit to Jerusalem 800 years ago by Baba Farid, who is one of India's most celebrated mystics. And he's supposed to have meditated here for 40 days. And there is still a cave and a small mosque within the boundaries of the Indian hospice compound, which is now home to a little cluster of Indian Palestinian families. Or really, it's rather one extended Indian Palestinian family. Just nearby is this place, the Afghaniya Hospice, and also the Bukhariya Hospice, which are two buildings built back to each other. They form this sort of small area, this community, with a centuries-long tradition of hosting Muslims from Bukhara and the neighboring lands of Central Asia, Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turkmen and Afghans and Uyghurs and many others as well. Just nearby to that is a neighborhood that is home to Jerusalem's Dom families, who self-identify in English as gypsies. Gypsy, the word, has a troubled history in English. It was invented around the 15th century because English people were looking at these newcomers who were arriving amongst them. They didn't know where they came from. They assumed they had come from Egypt, so they called them gypsies as a truncation of Egyptians. And over the centuries since then, the word has taken on pejorative meanings. Many people choose not to use it at all today. But in English, the Dom of Jerusalem used the word to self-identify, so I'm following their lead in that. And their history begins with waves of migration about 1,500 years ago, not out of Egypt, but out of India. And in those waves of migration, some people settled in Armenia and the lands of the Caucasus, and they are today the Lom people. Others moved on, continued traveling westwards into Europe. They are now the Rom people, or Roma people. And some settled in Turkey and Iran and the Arab lands of the Middle East, and they are the Dom. Lom, Rom, and Dom are all connected by a common cultural heritage, which is very underwritten and very under-researched. But the Dom have lived inside the walls of Jerusalem for 200 years or more. They suffer, as with communities in Europe as well and elsewhere, they suffer terribly from racism and from discrimination. They self-identify neither as Israeli nor as Palestinian. They occupy this sort of tiny socio-political space between these two larger communities. They are Dom, they are neither one nor the other. But because of the racism and the oppression that they suffer, Dom children very rarely graduate from high school. Levels of unemployment within the community are very high. Jobs, 2/3 or more sometimes. Jobs where they exist tend to be very menial jobs connected with service industries to do with drain cleaning or sewer work. It's a terrible situation for them. This lady is Amun, is her name, Amun Slim. She is extraordinary. I was also extremely lucky to make contact with her, and in the end I gave her a chapter in the book to explain her story and to explain the story of her community as well. She's an amazing person. She's done extraordinary work over more than 20 years, building community support networks among the Dom. She runs after-school clubs for Dom children who are now receiving extra tuition in maths and English and Arabic. She runs vocational classes for women. She runs literacy classes. She's improving hope and opportunity within her own community, in the face not only of racism from the Israeli authorities and from Palestinian society, but she's also, because of who she is, breaking gender barriers herself within her own community. She's challenging the patriarchal structures of power within the Dom as well. Her story, if you get a chance to read the chapter, is amazing. She's an incredible person who is doing and has done extraordinary work virtually out of sight. She is interviewed occasionally, but most of the time what she's doing is very grassrootsy. Talking of racism and discrimination as well, there's a center of African settlement right at the gates of Al-Aqsa. This is a community of around 450 Muslim people who have origins in West Africa and Central Africa. This is Musa Qaus, who volunteers at the African Community Center there. While I was looking at these stories, it struck me that all of this serves to reinforce the idea that if your history of Jerusalem does not include black history, Dom history, Indian history, or, in its very broadest definition, Arab history, then that's not a history of Jerusalem. This lady is Maysoon al-Maslahi. She's Palestinian, but her family originates from Morocco and Algeria. She's one of the very last remnants of Jerusalem's Moroccan quarter, which was flattened by Israel in 1967 in order to create the huge plaza that we now see in front of the Western Wall. And a few steps away is the tailoring outlet of Sami Barsoum, this guy here, who is the mayor of the Syriac Christian community, not Syrian, but they're an ethnic group who originate in the borderlands between what's now Iraq and Syria and Turkey. What we might think of now as Kurdistan, but they're not Kurdish, and they belong to a church which uses the Syriac language, which is one of the dialects of Aramaic, which was a lingua franca across the region before Arabic. And this image just by itself highlights the nonsense of that idea of exclusivity in the quarters previously. Maysoon's house and the mosque of the tomb that she looks after are in what's now called the Jewish quarter, but she's not Jewish. And Sami lives and works and prays inside what's now called the Armenian quarter, but he's not Armenian as well. And this runs across divisions. This guy is Avi Yefet, who is the caretaker of the Karaite synagogue, which is probably the oldest synagogue still functioning within the walls of the old city, originally established sometime in the 8th century. And this is yet another fascinating story of the Karaite Jews who are rejected as not being Jewish by most of Judaism and also by the Israeli state as well. Very briefly, mainstream Judaism draws two sources of divine authority for the religion. One is the written Torah, which is the 26 books of the Hebrew Bible, what we might know as the Old Testament. And the other is the oral Torah, which is a collection of commentaries and interpretations by the rabbis, which were collated and written down for the first time about 1,500 years ago as the Talmud. So mainstream Judaism draws both as being sources of divine authority. Karaite Judaism rejects the authority of the rabbis as being divinely inspired and focuses solely on the written Torah alone. That leads to a number of differences in doctrine and practice between mainstream rabbinic Judaism and Karaite Judaism, one of which, in these few pictures down the bottom here, is a very visual one. So when you approach a Karaite synagogue, as you enter, you leave your shoes at the door. The synagogue itself is generally just a carpeted space. It's clear of furniture. There are no seats or pews or anything. And then as part of the worship, as part of the devotion, you see these forms of worship which are now explicitly banned in rabbinic Judaism, like kneeling and prostrating and touching your forehead to the carpet to pray. There are obviously several intriguing parallels between Karaite religious practice and Islamic religious practice. And, you talk to one group and they will say, well, they copied us. And you talk to the others and say, well, they copied us. Exactly who copied who is unclear. There's a lot of work still to be done and a lot of research still to be made. But the parallels remain. But the consequence in this situation is that these communities who self-identify as Jewish and would be seen by outsiders as being Jewish are rejected by most of mainstream Judaism, and as I said, also by the Israeli state, which in a place like Israel that runs on these hierarchies of ethno-religious identification is a serious matter. Karaite religious marriage is still outlawed in Israel. There are other issues to discuss. I just want to finish this section, if I can, just with one point. The Palestinians of Jerusalem are under intense pressure. I don't have to explain to this audience the significance of what Israel is doing in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan and in a dozen other places in Jerusalem to try and make life there untenable for anybody who is not Jewish. Bruno Kreisky emphasized dialogue, and he emphasized a pragmatic, morally driven opposition to political violence in the heavily militarized security strategies that have dominated geopolitics for a generation or more now. We are all painfully aware of the preoccupations of those who are committing violence. It's now vital for us as Europeans to be in closer dialogue with the victims of that violence, the people who are facing injustice. As Kreisky advocated, we should strive for empathetic understanding. But also, in light of Kreisky's example, we should also be careful not to allow prejudice to cloud our judgment. So, as well as for the people of Jerusalem, I wanted to use my platform to write this book for my own generation of onlookers. I'm 53, people in their 40s and their 50s and 60s and 70s, to try and tell them that the stories that they grew up with about Jerusalem, about the four quarters, and the sectarian division, about how this is supposedly a war of equals, about how it's some age-old hatred between religions that can never be solved, or about how it's a conflict between two sides rather than what it is, which is an occupation by one side of another. How all of that is wrong. My generation needs to change its ideas in order that the next generation are better able to effect change. So these stories of mystics and tombs and all the different communities of Jerusalem are fun, and I love them, and they humanize the people of the old city. But my purpose in writing these stories was to weaponize them. There's a job to do among us all in terms of addressing the continued viability of how far things have been allowed to go in Israel. And a good place to start that work, I think, is in reimagining Jerusalem without its four sectarian quarters. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I'm very happy to go to a discussion now with Viola.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
I guess many of you, after hearing this short excursion, virtual visit to Jerusalem, are eager to read, and I really encourage you to read the book. Usually, stories about Jerusalem are very depressing, Jerusalem itself is often very depressing.
It's a very difficult place to be.
Yes, it's a very difficult place to be. And I was telling Matthew at lunch that for me this was really an eye-opening, because I have a very tricky relation to Jerusalem, and it really offers a different approach by deconstructing, and I think this is what Matthew is doing in the book, deconstructing all the images that we've grown up with, that we've been educated to, that we've been socialized to believe that are tied to Jerusalem, whether it's the two sides that actually are more than two, whether it's the four quarters that are more than four, or whether it's the monolithic setting of no matter if it's the Palestinian or the Jewish side. And the most, maybe for me, touching aspect of the book was that you brought those who are usually overseen, overlooked, overheard, and actually not taken for being there at all, to be at the center of the biography of the city, and having them tell the story. So I would like maybe to just also raise the interest of the audience to engage later in the discourse, but also to maybe read the book. And there we have some books outside for those who would like to buy one.
Can I ask you
yes.
a question? Since we're in dialogue, you talked about how your relationship to Jerusalem is a difficult one. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I know your family background is not in Jerusalem, it's Bethlehem, am I right?
Yes.
Can you explain why you feel that it's a difficult place?
Okay, I will answer very shortly, because I want to use the time to engage with you in some aspects of the book. So
I'm not trying to deflect that.
No, that's fine. But I can just say very shortly that when I was still in Palestine, and I left Palestine in 2002 after I got married and came to Austria, my office was in the Old City, actually in the Church of the Redeemer, as I was in charge of the Lutheran school system in Jordan and Palestine. Okay. Beginning actually with the Second Intifada, even before, I was not allowed to enter my office. So I was in home office at a time where there was still no pandemic.
Right.
So that was one. So having an office, not being able to enter, was for me being home very tough to deal with. And I've been living in Austria since 20 years. I'm an Austrian citizen, but I can only visit Palestine as a Palestinian. So I cannot enter with my Austrian passport, and that's why I cannot enter Jerusalem. So for the last 20 years, I haven't been able to succeed and get a permit to enter Jerusalem.
And I should say also, Bethlehem and Jerusalem are
7 kilometers.
I was going to say 8, 7, okay.
Yeah, I mean 7 to 8, but now it's all with borders, with the wall, and you need to have a permit. And for the permit, you need first to have the so-called magnetic card, which means you have to go through a security clearance and all of that. So, and the third one, and then I will stop, is within the last few decades, I have seen how, especially the Old City, when I was responsible for education, have been actually not only through occupation and through military, through all of that, but actually through the loss of future perspective for the youth, the increase of drug addiction, and all of that. I mean, we're losing the soul of the people, and I will come to that in a moment, because you have a story naming that. And also,
matters a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And also because Jerusalem, no matter if we're looking about Jews, Christians, or Muslim, is drawing on religious extremists in thinking, while those who are open to view the other are leaving Jerusalem. So there is a demographic shift even within the communities themselves in Jerusalem, and it's terrifying. It's terrifying for all. Actually, a friend of mine, a Jewish rabbi, was always saying maybe at one time we will only have the radicals in Jerusalem and we can put off the lights and then go and try to deal with our life.
Yeah.
And with that, actually, I would like to ask you,
Sure.
Matthew,
Sure.
to read something for us from the book, because I think that's really an amazing voice. And Matthew is, it's on page 318.
I can guess where you're going.
Yeah. Matthew has been bringing the voices of these people, and since you ask me now on why I have this ambiguous relation to Jerusalem, I would like you to read something that you quoting Jack with. Maybe you can say 2 words on Jack so that people can get along. Thank you.
This is Jack Persekian.
Yes.
Who is a gallery owner. He's an artistic curator. He's an artist himself, a photographer. He's running a contemporary art foundation, the only one inside the walls of the old city. He has an international reputation as well. He's worked in London and Sydney and New York and I don't know where. And he's in charge of cultural festivals in Palestine as well. He's an incredibly dynamic and articulate and visionary man. His family story is also fascinating. He has a chapter in the book as well, looking at how he built what he has built. But when I was talking to him, I've talked to him many times, but this particular conversation, he said something that struck me as so powerful that I gave it a couple of pages in the book to quote him in full without filtering through me. And I'd just like to share that with you if I can now. So all of this is Jack Persekian speaking. Jerusalem is becoming a mere symbol only, a religious symbol, a symbol of God and religion and nothing more, a token capital of Palestine. Holiness empties the city out because the holiness of the symbol becomes far more important than the living population. There's a whole generation of Palestinians, even 2, who don't know what Jerusalem looks like. They see it in pictures, but that doesn't mean a thing. It's very disturbing. Jerusalem is becoming less and less of a place where you can see people living, enjoying their life, creating a future for the younger generation. De-symbolizing Jerusalem comes through education. That's what art is trying to do, to make people think outside of these prescribed narratives, to look at things from different ways, express ideas and thoughts and feelings. It's about liberating yourself. Once more individuals are liberated from within, you can eventually start to evolve a society that is on its way to freedom. Otherwise, you can talk about freedom and liberation from here to Timbuktu, but if the people are shackled with all the baggage of religion and taboos and dominion by these bankrupt political parties, then it won't mean anything. I personally believe, and he says, and the people involved with Al-Ma'amal, which is the art foundation that he runs, and the people involved with Al-Ma'amal believe that we need to keep looking for ways to grow and build more of a base. It's been 20 years. We have a track record now, and we have credibility. It can happen. Art can liberate. Yes, the people of Jerusalem are on their way to freedom and liberation, but there's a huge obstacle. And that is finding means and possibilities for those people who are gradually realizing their potential. They are hitting up against finding a job, affording the city, decent living conditions, being able to manage with all the complex maze of laws and regulations that the Israeli government imposes in order to live as a Palestinian in Jerusalem. People see no possibility for growth here, even if you're brilliant a creator, if you've just invented something, or you're an industrialist and you want to open a factory, you can't do it in Jerusalem. You will have to go to the West Bank, or you will leave the country. It's a catch-22. People who I've seen manage to liberate themselves and gain that potential opt to leave Jerusalem and make their lives abroad. Those who stay here, a good number of them, are stuck, hopeless, helpless, desperate, depressed. One keeps trying and keeps working, but you're pushing against a huge wall. We've managed to keep a voice coming out from Jerusalem in art, in all the circles that art revolves in, locally and internationally. The voice insists that Jerusalem, with all of its historical religious baggage, has a contemporary art identity and is engaging multiple issues through the lens of art and the work of artists. It is saying that Jerusalem is worthy of attention. Unquote.
So
it's amazing. He's an extraordinary man.
Yes.
And the work he's done within Jerusalem, keeping that, as he says, that voice of art and the focus on how art can liberate the whole society. The work he's done is incredible. And the support he's gained, obviously the visibility that he's gained by doing that as well, is heartening. That's one counteracting force to the hopelessness that we were talking about before.
Exactly. And I think that's the voice of all the people that you've brought to the center in the book. They are all extraordinary in the sense that, in my understanding, they keep the hope alive in the sense that they continue to be Jerusalemite, which is in itself, in my understanding, a sense of countering all that is actually happening to Jerusalem 24 hours a day.
But that, as you'll know, that then becomes a form of resistance. Just retaining your presence, standing, sitting, staying in Jerusalem, then takes on a greater significance than maybe staying in London or staying in Vienna or staying in New York or whatever. It becomes a form of political resistance.
Exactly. You mention it also in another chapter where you're talking about being a Jerusalemite, whether it's a privilege or a right. Maybe you can say a few words on that.
It's wow. That's a big, complicated question. I'm hesitant to speak on behalf of Palestinians. That's the last thing that I want to do, especially sitting across from a Palestinian anyway. But as I understand it, Palestinian people view their Jerusalem identity as core. It is in a sense a privilege, but it creates an outlook and it creates a frame of mind that rests on this very strong idea, which you will know and maybe is familiar to the audience as well, of sumud, of it's very difficult to translate this word, but people translate it as steadfastness, a desire to stay, come what may, to focus on the bigger picture, on the wider picture, to connect with Jerusalem in a deeper way and to stay put regardless of what happens. That's a long, rambling answer to the question.
I mean, you also, in that sense, shed some light on histories that are overseen when talking about Jerusalem. At the end, when you're talking about the New Jerusalem, you're talking also about the 4 small outskirts, which are no longer there. Maybe you can share something on that?
Sure, yeah. These were, again, for the book, I was well aware when I was planning the book that, as I said, when I was standing up there, people have approached this before, and the possibility for this to spiral out of control, to take on too much, and the book starts to sprawl and it goes into all these different subjects. I wanted to focus in as tightly as I could on the old city. But I also wanted in the epilogue to contextualize a little bit where the old city lies. And I looked at these communities around the western ring of Jerusalem, which are now no longer there. Sheikh Bardo is one. Lifter is a very famous one, which is the only one of all of the several hundred, 500 or 700 Palestinian villages that were erased in 1948 and destroyed or built over or had forests planted over them. Lifter survives. It's still visitable today on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. It's in ruins. There's nobody living there. There hasn't been anybody living there for decades. But it's a presence. Lifter is a totem. It's a symbol of what happened. It's a visual symbol which has somehow escaped destruction. And because of that, Lifter, I think, again, you can tell me better, but Lifter has an unusual power. And there have been many, many efforts by the Israeli government, the Israeli municipality, by also Israeli private developers as well, to try and move in and to try and take over Lifter, and to use its visual power as a place where the architecture of the previous century has survived in some form. That also has a totemic power in Israel as well, where you will find previously Palestinian-owned houses in West Jerusalem or in other places, also in Jaffa and other cities as well, have been taken over, but they have a sort of chic, this idea of Arab chic in architecture is a very strong one within Israeli society, even though it's entirely divorced from its origins. It becomes a sort of a visual declaration of some sort of kind of historical link to some nebulous past before the founding of the Israeli state. But the actual links to people's lives are never explicit. It's never made explicit, and it's deliberately cut. Lifter as well has a power because of that. These other communities as well have now largely been erased. Obviously, a major one is Deir Yassin, which was the site of a terrible massacre in April 1948, and is now the buildings of the village are now form part of a psychiatric hospital on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. These presences are reminders, ghostly reminders, without sort of wanting to get too purple about it, but they're reminders of the forces of violence that led to the founding of the state. And I think they have an extraordinary power. Like I said, I was focusing on the Old City for this particular book, so I didn't go into too much detail, but I wanted to have them present as being a contextualizing element in part of what makes Jerusalem Jerusalem today. That's a very long, rambling answer. Does that come close?
Yes. I'll open in a few minutes for discussion.
I'd be very interested to have any questions.
We will have. I have 2 questions left on my side, and then you've dedicated some part of the book to women, to extraordinary women, actually, both historical but also in present time. So.
Like
if you,
Amun,
yes, exactly, and I think she's extraordinary. And just to bring the Gypsy community into the narratives on Jerusalem is by itself amazing, because even for the Palestinians, and I think that is also important, that monolithic thinking of who is a Palestinian, you are also deconstructing that image. In bringing all of these African domes and Syriac Armenians with all that plurality beyond that maybe imagined, pure, whatever sense of belonging there is. So if I would...
That plurality is really important. That plurality, not just in Palestinian society, but everywhere.
On that, exactly.
But particularly in Palestinian society, to be able to draw that out was a massive privilege and a massive honor to be able to do that. Thank you for noticing as well.
Thank you.
Sorry, you were going to ask.
No, I think if I would ask you to maybe choose one example of women that inspired you the most when narrating women's voices. Whom would you choose?
That's a great question, which is a way of buying thinking time. I'm going to give two answers. I'm going to give three answers, actually. The first is, since this is a sort of virtual walk or virtual tour in the old city, I'm going to name a place which is visitable, which embodies, for me, the hidden histories of women in the old city. It's also very unvisited, very unnoticed, which is bizarre because this building is the largest secular building within the walls of the old city. It's a huge palace on the slopes of one of the hills which comes down to Al-Wad, and across the way is Al-Aqsa, like I say, within the walls. And it was originally founded in the late 14th century by a woman who we think is called Tunshuk. That's an Anglicization. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. Tunshuk, maybe, but they're also Tansuk or some Turkic way of saying the name. We don't know who she was exactly. There are ideas that she was a princess from a part of what's now southeastern Iran, and perhaps that she arrived in Jerusalem as part of a conquest by Tamerlane of that particular region and the Muzaffarid princes that he conquered, and she was maybe displaced and she arrived in Jerusalem. We don't really know. She built the building in, if my memory serves me, 1389, and she lived the last few years of her life obviously wealthy, obviously privileged, in this large palace building. Her tomb is just across the alleyway from it today. She died in 1398. And then when, 150 years later, another powerful imperial woman, wanted to make a mark in Jerusalem, she built around and alongside and to extend this same building. We also don't know her name exactly either. She's called Roxolana, but that is a nickname which refers to her origins. She was a woman who was born enslaved in Ukraine, what's now Ukraine, which then was Rus. And so Roxolana is the linguistic origin of Roxolana comes from Rus. She was somebody from Rus, and she was kidnapped, trafficked, sold in Istanbul, in the slave market of Istanbul, to the mother of the person who became Suleiman, how we know him now as Suleiman the Magnificent, the great Ottoman Sultan of the 16th century. And she established charitable foundations and charitable institutions around the Ottoman Empire in Mecca, in Medina, in other cities in Istanbul as well, and also in Jerusalem. She never visited, as far as we know, but she built this charitable foundation, which still exists today. And it includes one particular lovely little story is a soup kitchen, which has served hot food every day to the people of Jerusalem without fail for the last 550 years. And I was very lucky to write an article about it. I think it's the oldest existing soup kitchen in the world, maybe, who knows, I don't know. But she built this extended building around that original palace of Tunshuk, and it still exists today as the largest charitable foundation in Palestine. There's a vocational training school, there's a mosque, there's a children's school, an orphanage. There are various entities which support the community of Jerusalem. And like I say, this is visitable, but you wouldn't know it but to look at from the outside. There's a couple of signs, but you would have to read Arabic to know what they mean. And there's nothing that says this is an extraordinary building built by two extraordinary women centuries ago. There's nothing there. Mm-hmm. That's one answer to your question about inspiring women. But just very quickly, the women who you can see today, these are women from the past who've made a mark. The women you see today, every day, particularly at the weekend on Saturdays, but every day when you walk through the markets of Jerusalem, you will pass by, as well as the stalls and the shops and the commerce and the life and the crowds, you will pass by sitting on the flagstones beside the street in these small alleyways, many, many women these are country women who are farmers, very often from Bethlehem or the region around Bethlehem, and they come into Jerusalem every day to sell produce. Mm-hmm. They sell herbs, they sell fruit, they sell vegetables. There's no contact really with tourists. Tourists are not, unless you buy a pomegranate or something in season, tourists are not interacting. And more to the point, they're not interacting because these people are marginal in society, but also marginal visually as well. They're down by your feet. They're squatting on the ground with their vegetables laid out beside them. But women, I found out while researching this book, have been selling produce of different kinds in exactly this way for at least 700 years, and quite probably much longer. But there are documentary records going back to the mid-14th century, which name some of these women, where they came from, the products they were selling. Some of them are different. The products now, they're not selling the same stuff. But just that longevity, that continuity of completely unsung contribution to the society and the economy and the identity of Jerusalem by women who very often are not even Jerusalemite. They come from outside. They come from Bethlehem or Hebron or somewhere. Extraordinary. That I found extremely inspiring and simultaneously also very difficult to approach. These women often, what they're doing is they're breaking municipality regulations. They don't have a seller's license. The produce they're bringing in, they're not allowed to bring it in. They're not allowed to sell where they're selling. So to try and interact with them is often very difficult. To ask questions, where are you from? What are you doing? Instantly you become a source of suspicion. So I'm sort of admiring these women and their presence from afar. I'm very conscious when I'm doing that of my outsider status. But they're a very visual reminder of how the ordinary people of Jerusalem build Jerusalem.
Thank you, Matthew. You're bringing to mind a film which was produced by one of our students at the Dar al-Kalima University in Bethlehem, a short documentary on his mother, the thyme seller. Okay. And he portrays his mother, who's from one of the villages between Bethlehem and Hebron, who wakes up at 3 a.m. To collect the wild thyme and then put them in small
like a bundle.
Right. Then put them on her head and try to go to Jerusalem, trying to overcome all of the street of the divisions so as to get there and to sell it so that the son can get his education and have a different future. And I think women in conflict zone, not only in Palestine, are contributing to life continued every day in ways that are often overseen because they are not on the scene of political discourses or international media at the center. So
I would love to see that movie. That movie sounds very interesting.
We have to share some more after this evening. I would like first to thank all the audience who have been with us online. Thank you for joining us tonight with Matthew Teller for the book, and I can encourage you to read the book and get a new, maybe, approach to a city that is called Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us and have a nice evening. So I open the floor.